He was the serial killer who could sail from a port undetected, who could arrive at another city unsuspected, able to target another victim. A serial killer who's a moving target can be hard to find. Was that serial killer Richard Doro?
Part of the inquiry was to monitor where Doro had been throughout his service in the Navy.
Doro's career as a naval seaman allowed him to travel from port to port.
As a sailor, he was in Perth one day, the following week he was in Sydney, the following month he was in New Zealand.
And he became almost ghost-like. He was elusive. He was a stranger in every town that he visited.
And in every town he was capable of killing before moving on. Until he settled in a suburb of Perth, Western Australia, where Richard Doro saw the light.
He found religion, we think, joining the Jehovah's Witnesses.
By then, Richard Doro was hiding a lot of secrets. He would one day deliver a note which revealed some of his ugly truths. But to this day, the full truth is still to be uncovered as investigators try to get inside the mind of a serial killer. The sea is sometimes slow to give up its secrets. The tragic stories it's witnessed remain untold. Locked deep beneath its waves, the truth can be kept prisoner. When Richard Doro sat down to carefully choose what would be his final words, he revealed only so much of his days as a sailor in the Australian Navy. But he wrote enough to torture those left behind, those who would wonder till they die what happened to loved ones whose lives had been ended, probably, but not certainly, by Richard Doro.
He commits suicide. He goes to a gun range, turns the gun on himself, and shoots himself. But not before leaving a suicide note.
In the suicide note, he stated that he'd been involved in the death of 3 women, but he didn't name the women and he didn't nominate the location where the women had died.
When you read the letter, it's full of I's. I'm doing this to be a better person. I'm doing this to get it off my conscience. I'm doing this because I need to let you know. There's this conflict within the letter between this person that he wants to be and ultimately the person that he is.
It seems cruel that he didn't reveal the names of his victims in his suicide note.
Cruel because by not naming who he had killed, the newly converted Jehovah's Witness had confessed enough to leave torment as well as grief behind.
His confession, written in a notebook and posted to his then girlfriend, said, "I did kill 3 times and it's the hardest thing to live with while trying to become a witness."
Was that all part of a mind game played by Richard Doro? He'd also left behind a trail taking in a continent because detectives can't be certain where he killed. Understanding the mind and investigating the actions of Richard Doro was a task for a Western Australian coroner in 2016 as he tried to answer a 20-year-old mystery. What had happened to Sarah Lee Davey?
Young, 21 years old, Aboriginal girl, had been staying with relatives, and apparently the last time she was seen, she told her relatives that she was going out. She went to pick up a handbag and she went to a bar.
The bar was in the small, beautiful coastal town of Broome.
About 2,000 kilometres north of Perth. Very beautiful, stunning beaches.
To this day, a former detective in the homicide squad in Western Australia can't be certain what happened to the girl who simply disappeared from Broome one day, Sarah Lee Davey.
Sarah Lee lived at the peninsula, and she used to come down most weekends and knock around with her friends.
She was seen in bars, having drinks with friends.
On that particular occasion, she'd come down to Broome. She'd been to a hotel, and I think she went to a nightclub, which was an extension of one of the hotels.
It's called the Nippon Inn and was one of the few places offering late-night entertainment back then, 1997. That same weekend, an Australian Navy vessel, HMAS Geelong, docked in Broome, and 19-year-old seaman Richard Doro went on shore in search of a good time.
And that's where we think she met Richard Doro.
By the time that he met Sarah Lee, she was on her own. She would have known nothing of Doro's past. Richard Doro had grown up in an abusive environment.
We know that he was born in Bundaberg, which is in Queensland, Australia. He was born in March of 1977, and he had a terribly difficult start in life. He was sexually and physically abused by a family friend.
Abuse that continued over many years.
This would have had an immense impact on his own ability to cope with life, his self-esteem, his mental health, all of these things.
And it's pretty clear that what unfolded later, that's where the seed was sown of that violence.
I think one of the most horrific aspects of abuse is that it usually is done by someone who you know and you feel you should trust. So as a consequence of that, your ability to feel safe, to ever feel safe, is completely gone.
What he suffered may have been when Doro was younger, but abuse has a slow fuse.
We do know that there's a substantial amount of clinical evidence that that young kids that experience this will have a really hard time later on. We know they have higher levels of depression and anxiety, are much more likely to abuse substances. So traumas in childhood we're learning more about every day, but we certainly know that they're potentially harmful throughout the lifespan.
By the mid-90s, Doro had taken a momentous decision which would impact on towns and cities throughout the coastal zones of Australia and New Zealand. Was it then he began to sow the seeds of murder and of mystery?
He joins the Australian Navy. In some ways, it makes perfect sense. You kind of leave what's wrong, you go away. But when what's wrong is something that you've experienced internally, is it something you can actually run away from? Because don't forget, he doesn't run away to resolve it, to address it. He just runs away.
On board ship, his inappropriate attitude to women was clear for all to see.
We know that there's some sort of altercation with a girlfriend. He's 17, don't forget. And he's gotten the girl pregnant, and this altercation is so severe that he's reprimanded by his superiors in the Navy. So we're beginning to see these little bits of antisocial behavior quite early on.
He was described by some fellow sailors as immature. He was far from popular.
Most of his colleagues were a little bit, they were reticent about him. They described him as a compulsive liar. They couldn't trust him. There was just a bad feeling about him. He had a nickname, Bambi, which, makes you think perhaps he had big brown eyes like a deer. But what is known is that his colleagues didn't like him. They were suspicious of him. They felt that he was odd. The response to the people that worked with him was not warm at all.
Whilst a seaman on the HMAS Geelong, Doro would have plenty of time on his hands. As he lay on his bunk, he would fantasise about what he might get up to at the next port of call. In January of 1997, his boat moored in Broome, and it was then that Seaman Doro headed for a club he'd been told about and met Sarah Lee. The couple seemed to hit it off. They left together. Nothing untoward was spotted.
There was CCTV, I think, at the nightclub, and to the best of my recollection, it didn't show anything.
A young 21-year-old woman who meets, a cute 19-year-old sailor who happens to be around for a night or two. They meet at a club, they hit it off. He looked normal, he was actually, pleasant looking, and so they go off.
Western Australia-based journalist Sonia Voigt has been piecing together the evidence in the story of Richard Doro and his encounters with women who either go missing or are killed.
The pair are believed to have left in a taxi together and travelled to the wharf where HMAS Geelong was moored.
Doro walked back to the ship. He walked past the gangway that went upon the deck where there was another seaman at the top of the deck, saw him and a young lady.
Doro told shipmates that they were going to have sex. The pair walked out of sight.
They walked to the end of the pier, which was in the darkness.
Another HMAS Geelong sailor called Dean Fraser saw Doro.
When he came back, the same sailor, Dean Fraser, reported that he had scratches on his face, that Doro had scratches on his face. And he didn't just ignore it, he asked him what happened. And Doro shrugged apparently and said, she didn't want to have sex with me and she's gone now.
There were others who saw the couple that night too.
There was a reported noise, and then Doro walked back and went up the gangplank and went on board the boat.
And that was the last time that Sarah Lee was seen alive. And to this day, she remains on Australia's list of missing persons.
What happened that night by the sea in Broome? Had Sarah Lee Davey become the first of those killed by Richard Doro? The ones that he'd written of in his 2016 suicide note. Police in Western Australia now know that Richard Doro has confessed to killing 3 times, but was one of his victims Sarah Lee Davey? Detectives have been able to prove that Sarah Lee had been with Richard Doro for much of that night.
There was certainly no doubt, because the sailor that was at the top of the gangway certainly said it was Doro that went past, and the friends that Sarah had been with that night certainly confirmed that she had been with him.
The morning after the couple had been together, Doro shipped out.
The HMAS Geelong left port then and headed back out to sea and towards Darwin.
Richard Doro had been in Broome just one evening, and he had left behind him a mystery. The day after being seen in a bar with Richard Doro, some of Sarah Lee's friends noticed that she wasn't around, but that wasn't unusual.
She's young, she's partying, she goes missing, nobody notices.
Effectively, it seemed to be part of her lifestyle at the age of 21, and so nobody was really worried.
It was several days later when the family of Sarah Lee Davey, who'd not been in Broome at the same time as Sarah Lee, returned. They soon reported her missing. Detective Paul Ferguson flew up from Perth to Broome to lead the hunt for Sarah Lee. The community was immediately helpful.
You know, when we went up there was a hovercraft working tourism up there, you know, even to the extent where the fellow up there donated the hovercraft and his time and did all of the shores and all in the harbour. And Broome is, you know, a tourist centre, but even the community felt the pain that the family were going through, and there was a hell of a lot of support by the local community to try and assist where they could.
It was clear something had happened.
When Sarah Lee was reported missing, and there was some concern in relation to the fact that she hadn't accessed a bank account and other bits and pieces, the detectives took it on as a suspected death.
As they tried to clear up the mystery, detectives were interested to hear from the young sailor that she'd been seen with. The Geelong was now in Darwin.
Durham was certainly without a doubt the person of interest that we try to focus on, and the investigation also then looked at his time in the service, where else he had been, whether there was any other incidents where he'd been.
Officers flew to Darwin to meet up with him.
They got up there, they made arrangements to interview him. He reported sick, and the medical team up in Darwin within the Navy said he wasn't fit to be interviewed.
Eventually, he did allow himself to be questioned, but not for long.
And midway through the interview, he got upset and the interview was terminated.
Doro gave nothing away. The police had wanted answers to questions. When the appeals were made for information about the missing Sarah Lee, more locals came forward to report what they had seen and heard that night. Doro was most definitely in the frame.
There were witnesses that heard yelling and screaming from the wharf that night. There was a local fisherman and he said he heard a female yelling, "Get off me," and words such as, "What are you doing?"
Doro had said yes, he had been with Sarah Lee, but they had gone their separate ways. It was hard to believe him. He offered no explanation for the scratches on his face, but there simply was not enough evidence to prove a case against Richard Doro, who was subjected to further questioning, this time by the Navy.
It's not long after this that his behavior is causing so much concern by those around him that he's asked to see a psychiatrist and get an evaluation.
Doro was referred for psychological assessment and he admitted to alcohol and cannabis abuse.
That evaluation is very telling. So they note that he's had a substance abuse and misuse with both drugs and alcohol, but they also critically note that he's displaying quite severe antisocial behaviors, and also that he scores highly on a trait that they call amorality, where he sees the world as a dangerous place, as a place that rejects him, and therefore he begins to enact that upon the world himself. In fact, one of the lines in the report says that there's an expectation that this young man would be prone to angry outbursts.
All of that may be true, but it did not prove him to be a killer, leaving the community back in Broome in limbo. A limbo that would last decades.
Any regional centre that has a major incident, whether it be a fatality or a homicide or something like that, has an impact on everyone in the town.
Doro's final letter has not helped clear up the mystery. Something had happened that night by the sea involving Lee Davey. The case of the missing Lee remains unsolved. It's a mystery. Her family denied a last chance to see her remains.
Well, like all prolonged suspicious death investigations, trying to find her body was paramount.
I think what's really sad is that Sarah Lee's body has never been found.
Lee Davey was last seen in January 1997. An inquest in 2016 was not able to designate her as having been murdered.
The coroner looked at all of the evidence and the coroner came to a finding that she was dead. However, the cause of death was unknown.
Cause of death unknown. She had been with Richard Doro. She had been at the end of the wharf. Screams had been heard. But that was not enough proof that she had been murdered. The coroner returned an open verdict. Some believe that Sarah Lee was one of those that Doro was referring to in his suicide note.
And although the circumstances surrounding her death couldn't be established, Richard Doro's association with her and his actions at the end of the wharf were raised by the coroner, but as the coroner stated, the fact that she may have fallen in off the end of the wharf. She might have jumped in here, though he couldn't make that comment, so it was an open finding.
But that is not the view of everybody connected with the inquiry.
Sarah Lee's death is still in limbo. Sarah Lee's parents would have some comfort that the investigation was on the right track. They were very much aware of the hurdles in relation to the alleged sightings of Sarah Lee after her meeting with Doro. So there would be some relief that the perpetrator had been identified, but legally the case is still open.
Was Sarah Lee victim number one? What about Doro's other victims? And where had he struck? Between 1995 and 1997, Richard Doro had docked in a number of cities.
What really makes this case so difficult is that over a really short time, just a few years, he travels kind of the breadth of Australia. He's in Broome, he's in Sydney, he's in Darwin, he's in Perth. I mean, this is a vast area. So he's constantly moving. So anyone trying to piece together this puzzle is going to have a really hard time.
Where else would the police investigation lead? Who else had he killed? Since the suicide, which left so many questions unanswered, detectives throughout Australia have faced a challenge. Do they have any missing person files of women that Doro may have killed? Doro's Navy lifestyle opens up grim possibilities.
Part of the inquiry was to monitor where Doro had been throughout his service in the Navy and see if there'd been any other incidents that was similar to what we were looking at.
A fact which complicates any analysis of the events of the timeline of Richard Doro.
Doro's career as a naval seaman allowed him to travel from port to port across the nation, and he became almost ghost-like. He was elusive. He was a stranger in every town that he visited.
So this too feeds in to his ability to kind of carry on like nothing's happening. You know, he's got a built-in alibi with everybody on the boat, and he's able to move from place to place, and it doesn't seem suspicious because, of course, that's part of his job.
There is one murder which Richard Doro stood trial for. Again, the story is made complex by the facts of Doro's nomadic life. 15 months after his night in Broome, with Sarah Lee still missing, Doro pitched up in Sydney. No longer in the Navy, he was then working as a mechanic and living not far from Rosebery Avenue in the city. To those he lived amongst, he appeared normal enough. Held down a steady job, was known to have female partners.
He could have, as his friends thought, he could be a ladies' man, and that he was attractive enough to attract young women and the trust of young women.
He was able to keep on with his life and, you know, move ahead like nothing was happening. So we know that he was able to hold down a job. We know that he was able to hold down a relationship.
Rachel Campbell was living in Sydney at the same time as Doro. She was 29 and had a daughter, but her life was not going as she'd planned. She and her boyfriend had experienced a messy split. Rachel was working in the city's red light district. The sex trade kept her in money. Rachel's life on the fringes of society was to end all too soon, on the night that she met Richard Doro.
In 1998, a young woman called Rachel Campbell was found in abominable circumstances in a car park of a church.
Rachel's mutilated body was found at St. Joseph's Catholic Church on Rosebery Avenue. By abandoning her in the car park, her attacker will have known it would soon be discovered. For those heading to church, a gruesome discovery was awaiting them.
It was a terrible attack, multiple stab wounds, human bite marks. I think the police were shocked themselves.
She'd been bitten, she'd been raped, she'd been strangled, she'd been stabbed.
Rachel had been out working as a sex worker. Whoever had killed her probably had had intercourse with her and appeared to have used a condom. 2 used condoms were found nearby. So vital evidence was discovered which gave hope that her attacker could soon be found.
DNA was taken from her body.
And living nearby?
Records show that in 1998, Doro was living in the vicinity of the Sydney church by which prostitute Rachel Campbell's body was found.
What we do know is that Richard Doro lived only a couple of streets away.
Doro, however, was not suspected. His DNA was not on the Australian National Database. There had been no witnesses. Linda Papadopoulos, in analysing the life of Richard Doro, sees a pattern between the disappearance of Lee Davey and the murder of Rachel Campbell. Her attacker, as Doro often did, seems to have lost control, to have snapped.
He had a very explosive, impulsive type of anger that would cloud his judgment. And one has to wonder if it wasn't something that played out that night as well. He was expecting something to go one way, it went the other way. And that's where he became extremely violent and aggressive. And again, you know, we have lots of people that speak to the fact that he was quite a violent, aggressive person. And, you know, that he was very quick to go there. And if that's the case, this young woman being alone with him in a situation where no one knew where she was, no one could hear her, made her extremely vulnerable, especially if she went against something that he wanted.
Detectives interviewed anybody who knew Rachel, spoke to those who went to the church, went on exhaustive house-to-house inquiries in the Rosebery Avenue neighbourhood and in the red light district of Sydney, but they were unable to make a breakthrough. At her inquest, the coroner made a prophetic remark. What we need, he said, is to find the person with the DNA that matches the DNA that we have now. That may never occur. It could occur tomorrow. Rachel's murder had taken place in 1998, and by the year 2001, there had still been no arrest. Doro needed to make a mistake to commit a crime which would mean his DNA would be taken. For now, it was time for him to move on. He headed out of Sydney. By 2001, Doro was back in his native Queensland when he got into trouble.
We know that things for Richard Doro aren't going great. Reports say that his behavior is very erratic, he becomes very violent, as predicted, has a lot of aggressive outbursts. In fact, one time he's so aggressive that he has some sort of altercation on the street and tries to mow someone down with a car, to kill them.
He runs down a pedestrian on purpose. It's a ferocious decision, terrible injuries.
It was 2 years since the discovery in a church car park of a body. He pleaded guilty, but offered his history of abuse when a child as mitigation.
When he was charged with the deliberate running down of a pedestrian, the judge took it into account. And the suggestion, I think, by a psychiatrist that he had confused his abuser for the person that he ran down. Now, the person that he ran down, it turns out, had attacked him earlier in the day. So there was this sort of psychological maelstrom, if you like, and his sentence was much more lenient than was expected.
Instead of getting a lengthy sentence, Doro was out in a year.
Arguably, that sentence was quite lenient. 5 years prison with a 12-month non-parole period which he served. However, that charge saw Doro's DNA added to Australia's national database.
He may have been treated leniently, and possibly correctly so, but the crime was serious enough for Richard Doro to be ordered to give a DNA swab.
The nub of this is interesting because that's when they get his DNA on file. And in a lot of ways, it's this moment that allows us to really get to know what was going on with Richard Doro.
Perhaps there was finally a chance to tie Doro to the murder of Rachel Campbell, and possibly to solve the mystery of what had happened to Sarah Lee Davey. But that was not the case. Whilst detectives in New South Wales had taken DNA from the scene of Rachel Campbell's murder, the arrest of Doro in Queensland was not linked to that murder. There has to be some evidence to link a traffic offence in Queensland to a sex crime and murder years earlier in Sydney in order for investigators to request to see if there is a DNA match which can be made.
He basically slips the net.
On his release, Doro set sail again, this time for New Zealand, where he lives in Auckland, working as a dive instructor. In 2006, another complication in the mystery of the disappearance of Sarah Lee Davey helps Richard Doro. Detectives in Western Australia make a link, one which turns out to be false, between a murder in the outback and the disappearance of Sarah Lee Davey.
Police were thrown off the scent of Doro in 2006 when they believed another man may have been Sarah Lee Davey's killer. That man was Bradley Murdoch. He was, and he's actually still serving a life sentence for the 2001 murder of British tourist Peter Falconio in the Central Australian outback. You see, Murdoch was actually in the Broome region at the time Sarah Lee disappeared.
Which meant Doro, at that stage still not in the frame for the murder of Rachel Campbell, was no longer the main suspect in Sarah Lee's disappearance. Doro went on with his life, eventually heading for Perth.
In 2009, he was back in Western Australia. He was living here in the Perth suburb of Osborne Park.
Not only was he in work and had a partner, he seemed no longer the impulsive, angry young man.
It seems that far beyond, the usual serial killers that we speak about, there's something very different here that doesn't fit that mold, that doesn't fit that kind of cookie cutter mold of someone that never had empathy, never had, any sense of remorse. This is someone that was very much, just not in control of his emotions. And as he grew and changed, went on, a real emotional journey.
He was working as a commercial driver most of the time, but also still found work on the sea. He helped maintain rescue submarines. All in all, He'd become a straight up and down citizen, but his past was about to catch up with him. In 2009, New South Wales police carry out a cold case review of the murder of Rachel Campbell.
There was a match found between Doro's DNA and DNA from Rachel Campbell's body. And so again, the spotlight is back on him. He's brought in, he's questioned.
And that means they're able to link him to the murder of Rachel Campbell.
And he was then extradited to New South Wales to face trial.
It appeared that justice would be done, that Richard Doro would be convicted of the murder of Rachel Campbell and possibly finally forced to admit what had happened with Lee Davey. Could Rachel Campbell be confirmed as one of the 3 victims that Doro says he killed? In 2010, prosecutors and police in Sydney prepared the evidence against Richard Doro. Despite the fact that DNA found on Rachel and on condoms discovered in the St James's Church car park near to her body, the case was not necessarily straightforward. She may have been with more men that night, Doro being just one of them, and she was estranged from her boyfriend. Might he have borne a grudge? There were potentially more suspects than Richard Doro, who pleaded not guilty and was about to walk free.
When he was charged and the jury then acquitted him for this particular case where the DNA clearly linked him to the dead girl, he admitted that he'd had sex with her and he admitted he bit her, but wouldn't admit that he killed her. The defence then brought in the fact that she had an estranged and boyfriend, and that potentially the doubt was thrown open and the jury effectively could not find that it was beyond reasonable doubt.
It seems incredible now, but the life that Rachel led had been in the shadows. Doro might well have been one of a number of clients that she'd had that night. The jury had believed him. In the crimes he was associated with, Doro seems to have been able to evoke sympathy, or at the very least, credibility. Crew members had believed him when he said that he had left Lee behind and that the scratches on his face were nothing to do with any crime. The judge, in his trial for driving into a man in Queensland, accepted that the abuse Doro had suffered had influenced his aggression. And now a jury believed that he was not a killer. Linda Papadopoulos puts Doro's apparent personality in a different category to that of a cold-blooded psychopath.
People just feel there's always that little bit of doubt. And I think the reason for that is that at some level, he didn't fit that picture of the classic serial killer.
Some detectives in Sydney were surprised by the verdict, but Doro had played the system. For Detective Paul Ferguson in Western Australia, Doro's acquittal may not have proved his guilt, but neither did it prove his innocence.
Like a lot of crimes, police have the responsibility to undertake an investigation. They do that investigation, they send it to the courts. At the end of the day, particularly if you're talking about the District Court or the Supreme Court, members of the jury, if they deem the person is not guilty, then that person walks free.
So was he a killer? Was Rachel victim number 2 mentioned in Doro's suicide note? Rachel Campbell had met Richard Doro on that night in 1998.
We don't know if he approached Rachel with the intent of killing her. He may have approached Rachel with the intent of sleeping with her. But ultimately what happens is a very violent, horrific attack.
She had been brutally murdered and her body cynically abandoned adjacent to a church. Doro had been with her before the attack, knew the church car park. He lived nearby, had an impulsive temper. But, officially not guilty, Richard Doro had walked out of the court in Sydney and returned to Perth. The trial had ended in 2010. Before long, Doro would become a changed man.
It's now 2014 and Richard Doro has literally lived in every state in Australia and New Zealand. He's traveled everywhere. We know that he's connected at this point to at least 2 homicides. And we also know that this is when he chooses to turn to God.
It was back here in Perth that Doro found God through the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Now, religion's interesting because it allows people to make sense of a world that feels chaotic. So even though bad things happen, there's a reason that bad things happen, that everyone can be saved as long as you want to be saved, that there's goodness in everybody, that, you know, even if you've done something horrible, that there, you know, there is love out there, there is forgiveness. So you begin to see the world in a different way.
His neighbours accepted him. He was Richie, a nice guy, not bad looking either.
He appeared as someone that had remorse, and I think his look, he was very much boy next door. I think people are predisposed to kind of feeling that when someone, you know, looks like, you know, their cousin, their uncle, their neighbor, that maybe there's nothing kind of behind that. And I think because of that, this juxtaposition between this violent, aggressive man and this actually very fragile, remorseful man that we saw later on, while incongruent, I think is the thing that allowed him to function for as long as he did and never get caught.
Life in the Byford area of Perth got back to normal after the trial that he had faced for the murder of Rachel Campbell. Sometime between 2011 and 2016, the former seaman began a new hobby, guns. He was known to go to the Lone Rangers shooting complex. He now had a permanent partner. So in Byford, Perth, Richard Doro got on with his routine. But something had changed. God and the Jehovah's Witnesses were now in the life of Richard Doro.
This is where it doesn't really fit in with that sort of, you know, central casting serial killer. This is a man who clearly at some point felt enormous remorse. He found religion, joining the Jehovah's Witnesses.
And in many ways, we know that his words following this religious epiphany actually attest to the fact that he begins, at least slightly, to see the world in a different way.
Being a Jehovah's Witness was about seeking forgiveness for any sins that he may have committed. And by 2016, that fact was going to answer at least some of the mysteries in the life of Richard Doro. It was now that he chose to reveal some of the truths of his life. In a darkened room in his home in Byford, he composed his thoughts. He put pen to paper and set about telling the world that he was a killer.
He posted his personal belongings, including his laptop and a suicide note, back to his partner. And within that, he made clear that he couldn't live with this huge guilt anymore.
But it was then he also took the decision, in writing his confession, which has caused agony and mystery. He did not name who he had killed, and he revealed that he had not taken 1 or 2 lives, which many suspect, but 3.
Unfortunately, the note didn't give any names, so the mystery remains.
He goes to all the trouble of writing a suicide note and a confession, yet he doesn't name his victims. So the question is this his way of kind of, you know, asserting control or torturing, or is it that he found these acts so horrific that he couldn't face up to them?
Having written his note, Doro was not about to stay around to answer the question. He drove to the shooting range. Inside, owners are meticulous in ensuring that firearms can only point at targets in the distance. But the mechanic brought with him the means to release a weapon, and in a booth, he turned it upon himself.
This fellow went to a firearm range and used the firearm at that range to shoot himself.
By killing himself, having admitted to 3 murders, Doro was leaving tragic mysteries unsolved. Was this a mind game being played by a serial killer?
With that letter, he takes with him ultimately what will be an unsolved mystery, because we know this other person could have been anywhere across this huge landmass during the span where he had this killing spree.
For Paul Ferguson, the note is a further tragedy for the family members.
I did 38 years in the police force, and you meet a lot of victims, and a victim can be a direct victim from an assault or whatever the case may be, or it can be the family of someone that's been killed. So, you know, closure is important to a lot of people, And when something like that occurs, particularly if you have some knowledge that your child had met with a sailor or a soldier or whatever the case may be, and then someone nominates, yes, I've killed 3 people, of course it would cause a lot of pain.
The coroner's inquest, which investigated the events of the death of Sarah Lee Davey in 2016, recorded an open verdict, and officially Doro remains acquitted of the murder of Rachel Campbell.
That doesn't necessarily mean that the investigative team or the family of the victim, whether it be a homicide or whether it be some other crime, aren't convinced in their own mind that the guilty party hasn't been convicted.
So for those investigating events, there are some answers provided in the note that he killed 3 times, but tantalising questions remain.
While it's assumed that 2 were Sarah Lee Davey and Rachel Campbell, who was his 3rd victim? And where was he or she killed? That's not been an easy puzzle for investigators to solve.
And yet that is now the challenge. Doro, when serving as a sailor, had moored throughout Australia and in New Zealand. Where had he killed? The suicide note was so vague, it leaves open the possibility that he also may have killed in his native Queensland. The mind of a self-confessed serial killer continues to taunt from his grave, and yet, for those investigating his mind, the suicide note is evidence not of a desire to control and manipulate those relatives of the victims, but because at the last, the abused Richard Doro may have realised the error of his homicidal ways.
He didn't have to confess, right? He didn't really tell anyone anything they don't know. I wonder if it was just one last way of kind of saying, maybe I'm not as broken as everyone thinks I am because I'm doing this one last thing. And don't forget, this is, immediately following him finding religion. And one of the things that religion gives a lot of people is the ability to forgive themselves, or at least the ability to see that maybe there's another way of looking at things. And I wonder if that's not what we're seeing, at least to some extent in the letter.
That is not the view of those who investigated him in New South Wales and in Western Australia. If he had been truly remorseful, then he would have left behind confirmation that he had killed Sarah Lee and Rachel Campbell, and he also would have named his 3rd victim. There is, of course, another possibility. Because of the nature of his days in the Navy, there is actually a good reason why he hasn't named his 3rd victim.
Maybe Doro didn't himself know all his victims' identities.
Doro knew the name of Sarah Lee. Even having only just met her, he had forgotten. By the time he was back on the ocean waves, subsequent interviews will have reminded him. He may not have known the name of Rachel Campbell when he was with her on the night of her death, but the subsequent court case will have reminded him. But he was not interviewed about the other murder, faced no court case. So if his 3rd killing was committed whilst he was a sailor, it may be another secret, kept by the sea and by Richard Doro.